Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Gittin Daf Tes Zayin. We're going to start on the bottom of Tes Vav Amabeis. Daf Yomi is 16 of Kiddushin. I'm just finishing up the sugya that we did yesterday. Gemara wants to know that we know that Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Kiva used the pasuk of V'yatza B'shnas Hayovel to teach us that if a Jew was enslaved by an idolater and he's redeemed, then there's a dispute between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva whether or not he becomes a slave or he goes free by the Jew who redeemed him. And the distinction is if he's redeemed by his relatives, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says he goes free. But if other people redeem him, he becomes a slave. And Rabbi Akiva says the opposite. If his relatives redeem him, he becomes a slave to them. If other people redeem him, he becomes free. The Rebbe, so now 3 lines from the bottom of 15b, the Rebbe asked the question, Hi, what does Rebbe do with that pasuk? And by the way, look at the Tanya. Rebbe learns that verse like we learned in the Brights. Top of Tes Zayin and Aleph. What is this referring to? And it refers to if you have an idolater who's under your sovereignty, such an idolater, the Jew goes free at the Jubilee year only, but not after 6 years. So the Gemara says, maybe it refers to a Jew who's under an idolater's reign, who's not even under the Jew's sovereignty. The Gemara says, well, if he's not under your sovereignty, if the idolater is not under your sovereignty, why do we need to be told the Jew doesn't go free after 6 years? The idolater doesn't answer to you. So therefore, the pasuk is only referring to an idolater who's under your domain, and we're saying that a Jew does not go free after 6 years. He does go free after the Jubilee. He does go free at the Jubilee year. We were discussing yesterday. Well, why do we care? I mean, why is the Torah going to be so strict and say that the Jew doesn't go free after 6 years if he's a slave to the idolater, whereas if he's a slave to another Jew, he does go free after 6 years? And one of the answers I was thinking was that because the Jew might be more quicker to redeem him if we know he goes free. He not going to go free after 6 years, so we can't wait and say, oh, he'll be redeemed after 6 years. So then we say that an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, can be acquired with a shtar. Hebrew slave can be acquired with a contract. So the Gemara says, what's our source for this idea? Mino and Amar Ua, Amar Kra. The Gemara is going to say that Ua says it's based on a verse by a Ama Ivriya, by a female slave. And we compare a female slave to a male slave. So just like a female slave can be acquired through a contract, so too a male slave can be acquired through a contract, a male Hebrew slave. And what's the source for Hebrew slave? It says in Macharas Yikachlo. It says by Hebrew slave that if he takes another wife, in addition to the Hebrew slave, he can't diminish the rights of the Hebrew slave who was his wife. The Torah compares the Hebrew slave to somebody else. It would say, just like a regular woman is betrothed through a contract, so too the Hebrew slave woman can be acquired through a contract. And therefore, so too a regular Hebrew slave can be acquired through a contract. Gemara says, this only makes sense according to the position. It says, shtar amay don't go so that the shtar, the contract of the Hebrew slave, the master writes it. Well, then in that case, we have a direct parallel to the betrothal of a woman. Just like by a woman, the person who is betrothing her, i.e., the husband, writes the contract. So too by the Amay Vriyah, the man who is acquiring her, the master, writes the contract. But according to the one who says the father writes the contract, well, that would be the equivalent almost of the woman writing a contract to the man. So there in Ma'iko and Maimer, the two cases are not parallel. What would you say? Didn't matter because we learned that there's a dispute amongst the Amoraim. Shtar Ama Evriyah Mikosva. Who writes the contract for the Ama Evriyah? Rafuna Amar Adon Kosva. So this proof works according to Rafuna. In Macharas Yikachlo. But Rav Chisda Amar Av Kosto. Rav Chisda says the father writes it. So Anicho Rafuna works according to Rafuna or Rav Chisda. Ma'iko Maimer according to Rav Chisda. What would you say? So Amar Vacha Bar Yaakov Amar Kra. So therefore, Rav Chisda would have to base it upon a different verse. What's the different verse that he would base it on? The different verse that he would base it on is Lo Seitzei Kitzei Savadim. It says in the pasuk that if the Ama Ivriyah is that if he sells his daughter to be a slave, she does not go free like the other slaves. Meaning to say, she doesn't go free like the other slaves, but but she's acquired like the other slaves, i.e., through a contract. Shtar, meaning to say, she is acquired like the other slaves, meaning the Canaanite slaves, and they are acquired through a contract. As we're going to learn in Daf Chaf Beis in our chapter, that a Canaanite slave is acquired through a shtar, kesef, and chazaka. So the Gemara says, Umay liu. What's the other way? Shtar. That's the way a Canaanite slave is acquired through a contract. So too, this woman will be acquired through a contract. The Gemara says, Ve'ema. Maybe it means avon niknasi kikinyan avadim. Maybe it means she's acquired like the Canaanite slave. And how is a Canaanite slave acquired? Through chazaka, through proprietary act, an act showing ownership. And chazaka, and maybe that's the way this Ama Ivriya is acquired. The Gemara says we don't say that because the verse says Amar Kravis nachaltem osam of nechem achareichem, and you shall bequeath them to your children after you. Otam b'chazaka, the Canaanite slaves are acquired through chazaka. Well, achar b'chazaka, but not the Ama Ivriya is not acquired through chazaka. So the Gemara says, but maybe it's the opposite. Ve'ima osam b'shtarvo achar. Why do you interpret the verses to tell us that Canaanite slave can be acquired through a chazaka, but not the regular Ama Ivriya, whereas the Canaanite slave can be acquired through a contract and the Ama Ivriya can also? Why don't we just reverse it? Maybe the Canaanite slaves can be acquired through a contract and not the Ivriya. Where it says no, because we don't say that because it says you cannot go out like the slaves. Verses, but it's Maraisa. Why do you say that this verse is including the Amavriyah be acquired like a Canaanite, and the other verse is excluding them? Why don't we just say the opposite? More logical to say that the contract is being included, meaning to say when it says that it says that Amavriyah can be acquired like a Canaanite slave through a contract. Why? Because a contract also works to divorce a Jewish girl, so therefore it can work to acquire a Canaanite slave. The Gemara says acquire an Am Ivriya. The Gemara says Adrabah Chazaka, just the opposite. We should say it's coming to include Chazaka from. We'll say Savadim. We should say it includes a proprietary act as way of acquiring Am Ivriya. Why? She can't call Seagir because we know that Chazaka works to acquire the assets of a convert who died. Where says, yeah, but the Ishus Milo Ashkan, we don't find Chazaka as a way of acquisition through marriage. And so therefore, that's why we say it's including a contract. Or Ibayis Ema, or alternative answer is Lahachi Ahani Imacheres Ikacho. Or for this reason, we have the verse of Imacheres to compare the way of Am Ivriya to the way of a regular marriage through Shtar and not through Chazaka. Rav Huna doesn't need all these drashos because Rav Huna learns out from Imacheres Ikachlo that Am Ivriya is acquired through a contract. So if that's the case, what does Rav Huna do with the pasuk? I will say it can say Savadim, my Darshbe. What does he do with that pasuk? He doesn't need it to tell us that Am Ivriya can be acquired through a contract. So the Gemara says, it's to tell us that Am Ivriya was a Hebrew slave. She doesn't go free with if the 24 limbs on her body are severed or damaged like a regular Canaanite slave does. So the Gemara says, Rav Chisda, how does Rav Chisda know that halacha? He says, that would be the case. It could have just said, well, say kavadim. Mike could say savadim. Shema minatarti. Rav Chisda says we learn both things. It says kitzei savadim. We learn that Am Ivriya is acquired through a contract, and we learned that the Am Ivriya does not go free if through Shem V'ayin and the 22 other limbs. The tooth in the eye and 22 other limbs are knocked off. Then it says in the verse that the Hebrew slave acquires himself with years, i.e., serving 6 years. How do you know? 6 years he shall work, in the 7th year he goes free. For Yovel, how do we know he goes free in the Jubilee year? Because it says, Ad Shnas Yovel Yavod, Ad Shnas Yovel Yavod Imach. He shall work with you until the Jubilee year. The Giron Kesef, by basically with the reduction of money, and then he redeems himself. Amar Chizkiah, the Amar Krav, Ve'efta. Says in the pasuk, Ve'efta la'am nachri. If he is redeemed, if he redeems her, what did we learn from that pasuk? Melamed shemegara pidjona v'yotza, that she reduced the amount that she was bought for, and then she redeems herself through that money, and she goes free. So Tana, we learned in the Bryce, we learned in the Mishnah, V'kones atzmo b'kesef u'b'shav kesef u'b'shtar. So we learned in the Bryce that the Hebrew slave can acquire himself with money, equivalent to money into the contract. Bishlam b'kesef, I understand that he can acquire himself with money. It makes sense to say that the slave can acquire himself with money because it says mikesef mikna. So it says if there are many more years from the amount of money that he was acquired for. And Shava Kesef Nami Yashiv Gua. So I also know the equivalent of money because it says in the pasuk, it says Yashiv Gua. So if there are many years left, he shall basically give back the money to redeem himself. Or Rabbo Shava Kesef Kesef, that's coming to include the equivalent of money, like money. So that's what we learn out from the words Yashiv Gua. So hold on one second. Yashiv is an extra word because it could have just said Lefien Gua. So why say Yashiv? That even if it's not actual money, it's just equivalent. But what is this contract that the Hebrew slave uses to acquire himself? Let's say he writes to the master a contract that he's going to pay him this amount of money. Well, that's like money. That's like a check, or it's shava kesef. But if you say it's a document of emancipation, why does he need that? The master could just tell him in front of two people, get out of here. Or if you want, you could say it in front of a court. Zeal, go. Why does he need a contract? To tell us in Evid Ivri Gufo Kanoi. No, the Hebrew slave, his body is acquired by the master, and so therefore, he needs to have an actual contract releasing him. And if he won't, then he'll just come back and come back. And so this is what Rava says. If the master wants to waive the money that he's owed, it doesn't work. He has to write him a contract. Yisero of Ama Ivriya. The Ama Ivriya is another way of being released, and this is the way of what's called Ama Ivriya should be released through Simanim. Amar Reish Lakish, but Reish Lakish says that there's another way which is not listed in our Mishnah, in which the Ama Ivriya is released. And what's this additional way? Kones Atzma B'Misa Sa'av Mirashus Adon. So the Ama Ivriya, she's sold by her father to the master. And then if her father dies before she's 12 or gets simanim or 6 years, then we're logical argument. Just like signs of adolescence, they don't completely take her out of the domain of her father, because even when she's a Nara, her father has certain rights over her. Misa, but death, but if she dies, if her father dies, she's no longer under his domain at all. For sure should take her out from her master's domain. So the Gemara says, Rav Oshaya challenges Reish Lakish. Rav Oshaya. It says, Yisero of Ama Ivriya shekones hatzam b'simanon. Our Mishnah says that the Ama Ivriya has extra way of being released. because she acquires her freedom through signs. It's through signs of adolescence. Vim Isa, and if it's the case, she also acquires her release through the death of her father. Nisne Nami Misa Sa'av. It should have also listed this case where her father dies. So the Reish Lakish's response would be Tana Vashir. Yeah, the Mishnah lists cases, but leaves over some cases, not a complete list. Gemara says, well, the high shear, my shear, the high shear. Well, what you'd have to prove in order to say that if the Mishnah left out cases, you'd have to prove that this wasn't the only case that left out. The Gemara says, I'll tell you what it left out. It left out Misa Sa'adon. She also goes free with the death of the master. The Gemara says, no, Imishum Misa Sa'adon, if you want to say she goes out because of the death of the master, Lav Shiuru, that's not a case that was left over. The given the Ikonami Be'ish Lo Katani. No, because a man also goes free. A Hebrew slave also goes free with the death of his master. Because Rashi tells us if somebody, not a regular Hebrew slave, doesn't go free with the death of his master, but a Hebrew slave who has his ear pierced goes free with the death of the master. Because as we learned earlier, he does not serve the son; he only serves the master. Ella nisni tana davar sheyesh lo kitzva katani, davar she'en lo kitzva lo katani. Okay, the Tana only lists those cases that have a fixed time. Those are the cases that were listed. So this case, which has no fixed time, i.e. the death of her father, wasn't listed as one of the ways in which the Amavriya goes free. Gemara says, but why? Simanin, the signs of adolescence, the Elam kids, but they don't have a fixed time. People get them at all different ages. Some get it quicker, some get it lower. And nevertheless, Katani, it's listed. Amar Rav Safra, yeah, Rav Safra says, Elam kids from Amala, yeah, there's no upper fixed time. Meaning to say, whenever you get the adolescence, whenever you get the signs of puberty, you're an adult, then she goes free. But there is a fixed time with respect to the earliest time which we allow them to appear, or where we say it's a fixed, we say it's considered signs of adolescence. As we say on the top of Tezainam Abayz, the Tanya, Bentesha Shanam She'edi Shtei Saros. Let's say you have a 9-year-old who brought forth 2 heirs. We say that we don't view that as puberty. We view it as a shuma. We view it as a mole, and he's still a minor. Let's say it's from 9 years old to 12 years old, and they're still on him. The signs are still on him. Then we're going to say that under those circumstances, it's also a shuma, it's also a mole. Whereas Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says siman. That there, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda disagrees with Tanakh. He says from 9 to 12, if he still has the hairs on him, we're going to say it's signs of puberty, and he's an adult. Whereas Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, and then the Mishnah concludes, or the Brisa concludes, Ben Yud Gimel Shanim B'Yom Echad, and from 13 years old and up, Divrei Kol Siman. Everybody says that boy, if he has hairs, it's a sign that he's an adult. So we see from here there is a limit on the lower end as to what it starts, and that's why. And so therefore, that's why it was listed in the Mishnah. Matzav Rav Sheshes, so Rav Sheshes challenges Reish Lakish. Again, Reish Lakish says that she goes free with the death of her father. She goes free from her master with the death of her father. If she's an Amevriya. So Rav Sheshes challenges Reish Lakish. Says Rav Shimon Omer Dalan Manikim. There are 4 types of people who get severance gifts when they leave their master. Gimel Ba'ish, 3 of them are categories applied to a man, but Gimel Ba'isha, and 3 by a woman. And what are these cases? So that Rashi tells us tonight, Pugila, come on. The Gemara is going to show this later on, that this is a dispute amongst the Tanaim. Ikol Amand Amar Boreach V'Yotze Begirin Kesef Emanikim. Well, there are some who say that if he runs away or if he redeems himself, we don't give him the severance. Ikol Amand Amar Yotze Begirin Kesef Emanikim. Some say if he redeems himself, he does get the severance. Fikach Kavam Ben Reb Shimon Minyan Arba. Therefore, Reb Shimon says that there are 4. He counts them, and running away and Giraon Echaman, and he doesn't count running away or redeeming himself as part of the severance because Al Kadai Tachasha. So now the Gemara assumes Shehein Ayotze, that what are the 4 cases? That 4 cases are case number 1, Ayotze B'Sheishan, and one goes free after 6 years. Yotze B'Yovel, one goes free at the Jubilee year. V'Nirtza Sheyotze B'Misas Adon, and a person whose ear is pierced who goes free with the death of his master, the Simon and the Amevriya, and the signs of adolescence of the Amevriya. So now those are the four. Again, 6 years, Jubilee year, the death of the master if he had his ear pierced, and the signs of puberty of the Amma Ivriya. So therefore, the Gemara says, Rav Shimon says, Dal Manikam Wem, Gimel Beish, Gimel Beisha. There are 3 by man and 3 by woman. And you can't say 4 by either a man or a woman, because there are no signs of adolescence by a man. And the woman can never be the category of the man who pierced his ear to remain a slave. And if it's the case that we're also going to count the death of her father, it should say the death of her father, she doesn't get the severance pay. If you want to say here too, the Tana left left out this case. Well, Arba Katani says there are 4. Well, maybe it's just not listing it because there's no fixed time. But he does list the signs of puberty. Meaning says puberty does have a sign, the lower sign. But didn't we just say that there's the death of the master in the case of the nirtza, where there's no fixed time, and yet we listed that case that he does not get the money there. The katani. Gemara says, you're right. Mios adon nami lo katani. So, nevertheless, the katani misos adon nami lo katani. So if that's the case, Delam kitzra katani, but the misos adon. So if that's the case, the death of the master, it also shouldn't be listed. So the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Shimon does not count the death of the master. What's the reason? Because he doesn't count those. He also doesn't count this case where the death of the master through a nirtza, where the Hebrew slave goes free. Ella arba minu. So if that's the case, what are the 4 that he's listing? What are the 4 cases that Rabbi Shimon is listing? That when Rabbi Shimon says there are 4 cases, 3 by a man, 3 by a woman. What are the 4 cases? Minu shanim. There's 6. After 6 years, he goes free. The yovel sharitzia va'ama ivriya. So he's counting he doesn't count the death of the master. He just counts the yovel sharitzia. That the Jubilee year counts for 2. One is a regular Hebrew slave who goes free at the Jubilee year, and also the Yovel Shel Ritzia, that a person whose ear is pierced goes free at the Jubilee year. Va'ama Ivriya B'simanim. And so those are the 4. So he's not counting the death of the master for either one of them. And this is indeed logical to read it. Because the concluding clause says, and you can't have 4 by either case because there's no signs of adolescence that doesn't allow a man to go free. And the woman doesn't go free with the piercing of the ear with the death of her master. And if you would be counting the death of the master, Bim Isa, and if indeed you would be counting that the death of the master is one of those 4, you would find 4 cases. And so it says explicitly in the case, so we would see that would specifically be 4. So Shema Mina, the Rabbi Shimon does not count the death of the master. So Masav Rav Amram. So Rav Amram challenges. Reish Lakish in the following: the Elu Manika Lam. These are the ones who you give severance. Hayotze b'shanim u'biyovel b'misas ha'adon va'ama ivriya b'simanim. It says explicitly in this brisa. These are the ones who give severance. One who goes free through 6 years, through the Jubilee year, through the death of the master, and through the Amma Ivriya b'simanim. Him Isa, and if it's the case that she also goes free with the death of her father, this name now you should also list the case of the death of the father, and then go through the same questions again. If you want to say just left it out, so specifically, these are the ways. It doesn't say anything that's not specific, but it lists the signs of adolescence. But it says explicitly the case of the death of the master. So why doesn't it list the death of the father? So indeed, to Yuvda, the Reish Lakish. Indeed, this is indeed a refutation of Reish Lakish's position. It says, Reish Lakish Kav Chomer. Didn't Reish Lakish have a Kav Chomer proving that the death of the master, the death of the father allows her to go free? Kal v'chomer pricha. It's not a great kal v'chomer. Why? Mishum deiko mifrach, because you can break the kal v'chomer by saying malas imanim sheneshtama aguf. The reason why she goes free with signs of adolescence is because her body's changed. Are you going to say the same thing by the death of the father? Tomar b'misas av shekain lo neshtana aguf. Are you going to say that by the death of the father, where her body doesn't change at all? So she shouldn't go free there. Tani chada. So we learned in one brayso so that it says anak eved ivri la'atzmo, that the severance pay of the Hebrew slave goes to himself. The anak ama ivriya la'atzma, and the death and the severance pay of the ama ivriya goes to. We learned in one brayso so that the severance pay of the Hebrew slave goes to himself, and we learned in another brayso so that the severance pay of the female slave goes to herself. The Tanya Idach, whereas the alternative brayso says, Anakam Evriya Umitziyaso Avia. The alternative brayso says that the severance pay of the Hebrew maid slave and the money she finds goes to her father. The Ein Rabba Ela Star Batobavad, but her master doesn't get her lost objects, and he doesn't get the severance pay. The only thing he gets is Star Batova for lost objects. So why is it the case that in one case we say that she gets her own severance pay, and why in the other case we say the severance pay goes to her father? So the Gemara is basically recording two contradictory braysos. Again, the first brayso says that the severance pay of the the severance pay of the Eved Ivri goes to himself, and the severance pay of the Ama Ivriya goes to herself. And the other source says that it goes to her father. So how do we deal with this? My love, isn't one case where she goes free with the signs of adolescence. So there she'll get it for her. It's there, it will go to her father. And when she goes free with the death of her father, then she gets to keep it. And so we see from here that this is a support for Ish Lakish, who says she goes free with the death of her father. Where it says, no, Idi v'Idi did not go be simanim. No, in both cases where she goes free with simanim. And so if that's the case, why does in one case does the severance go to her, and one case to her father? So it's not difficulty. How do we, in the brayso it says that the in the second brayso where it says that the father gets it because he's still alive, and the first case where the father doesn't get it, it's where he's not alive. The Gemara says, well, bishlama anak ama evriya atzma. I understand that it says the severance pay goes to herself. That's to exclude the brothers. Mutiachan v'tanya nisnachal temo some of nechem acharechem otam of nechem v'lo benosechem of nechem, because it says about the Hebrew slave that is acquired, that we learned, about a Canaanite slave. It says about the Canaanite slave that they go to your children after you. Oh, some of nechem v'lo benosechem of nechem, that you inherit. Meaning to say that when it comes to Canaanite slave, from the words "Visnachaltemo some of nechem acharechem," we learn that Canaanite slaves you bequeath to your children through an inheritance, but you don't bequeath their daughters to your children as an inheritance. Mikan she'ein adam morish slut bito v'vno. So we learn from here that a person does not give the rights that he has in his daughter to his son. Ella anek eved ivri la'atzmo, but why does it need to tell us that the Hebrew slave gets his own severance pay? Pshita, of course he gets his own severance pay. Ella man, who else would you think it goes to? So Rav Yosef, Yud Keres Kachazina. So Rav Yosef says, we're seeing a little, like you're making a mountain out of a molehill. He says, Yud Keres, Rashi says, Yud Shi Ketana Asa Ir Gedola Komar Herech Mishnah Soch. The Mishnah went on for nothing, meaning to say it's there's nothing there. And there's no chiddush. Abai Amar Hachi Amar Rav Sheshes. So meaning to say it would just listen for no reason. Abai says, I'll tell you, this is the chiddush of why it says it. This is who taught this brayso? Tutayu, Titanya, Tutayu Omer. It says in the verse, Hanek Tanik Lo, the Lo about Chovo. It's to teach us that who gets the rights of the severance pay? The rights of the slave himself gets it, but not the creditor. And even though we learned earlier this concept of Shibuda de Rabbi Nassan, which is that if A owes money to B and B owes money to C, that C can go and take the money straight from A. But that doesn't apply to the severance pay of the Hebrew slave that if there's a creditor, the creditor can't take it. This is protected money that can't be touched. And that's a very important Kiddush that's being taught here. In this case, we don't say the Shibuda de Rebbe Nassim. Okay, a big shkoyach to everybody. We'll stop here, and God will continue at 8 o'clock, and we'll continue. Baruch Hashem. Shkoyach.
Thank you.
Shkoyach.